facts are open source developers lack any original thoughts. They steal everything. We know that. There are lawsuits that are proving this. Additionally, open source developers don't bathe. They can't tie their shoelaces. They don't shave. They're obviously not like the rest of the world. They can't be trusted except to steal. We know that. By the very act of creating free software, open source developers put honest to goodness, wage-earning software developers out of a job. This is a truly tragic situation. The country is going to be sent bankrupt because software developers who are honest and get paid to write software, truly reliable software that the country depends on, are going to be wiped out of existence. This is going to have tremendous economic casualty. And on top of all of that, you can't get any insurance. You get no assurance. The licensing terms are viral and are going to take over your company and your company's product. You can't run anything on this open source stuff. You can't trust it. So the proposition, if I may finally get to the punchline without any undue interruption from the man at the end of the table there, open source software destroys the software industry. Okay, we're all in agreement then, are we, gentlemen? Okay, it cripples innovation. There we are. So we'll see innovation walking around at the conference with a pair of crutches.
An open source project. Didn't call it open source, but it was a free and openly started project that is the basis of the internet. I can add to that Mosaic, okay, which is the first web browser and web server, open project. These are all innovations. Hey, I think there's plenty of innovation. Wait a minute. I mean, Bill Gates, even when he saw the internet, said, "Hey, this is not going to amount to much, right?" It took him 2 years before he finally said, "Hey, I should buy Spyglass and make that, Internet Explorer," right? So he took a third-rate browser and put it into his product.
The people that tend to say that, and I actually said this in my presentation yesterday, the people that tend to make these claims tend to be the people who are least familiar with the free and open source desktops. Because if they use it day to day, they would start to see the innovation. The core of the myth here is that there is something different about developers who are developing closed source software and developers who write free software, as if they're like two different animals. One comes from Jupiter, one comes from Pluto, and they're just fundamentally different animals. Uranus, yes. So those who don't wash and whatnot, yes. And I will say, some of us prefer not to shave. So, but anyways, hold on. And that's not true. They're the same people. A lot of people who develop closed source software, I mean, myself, I get paid during the day to write software that my clients use and nobody else uses. It's proprietary. I also write open source software, free software. And this is true about most of the people behind free software. So we have to ask ourselves, well, why don't we see the innovation on the desktop, which is what usually people are talking about, because as John pointed out, if you just take a cursory glance at the OS level and at the server level, there's innovation everywhere. Well, the difference is that in the time when operating system development research was huge and hot compared to now, when all these basic infrastructural technologies were coming out, there was a large open research and development community, if you will, universities and whatnot. It wasn't so commercially pinned down, and so these things flourished in the open. Now, fast forward to the point where we're trying to do free software desktops and open source desktops. we started, to be honest, way behind where the state-of-the-art was. When the open source desktop started, we had a mishmash of applications on top of X. We had window managers that, I mean, I like them, but I'm not your typical user. For the average user, it was way behind what you get from a Microsoft or an Apple. So we had this huge gap to close infrastructurally, let alone feature-wise. But now look what happens when we start to catch up, now that we're gaining parity, and look at the applications that come out now. We start to see innovations. I mean, Firefox took its horn about a lot of the features you see in there. A number of them appeared there first. Some of them appeared in Conqueror first, the KDE project. Using meta contacts and instant messengers, where you have one contact with multiple IM accounts behind it, and the instant messenger account that is sent to is automatically picked for you based upon their presence. That first appeared in the KDE program. We're starting to see innovation on the desktop appear for two reasons. Number one, we have enough of the tools around us to start developing cool software on the desktop. And number two, there is once again an open research and development community around these things. And those are things that for a brief period of time didn't really exist as they once did. And so the people like Microsoft and Apple and others love to tell everybody as well, there's no innovation there, because it's hard to see.
Sounds to me like you're just offering empty promises, though. Yes, but they don't exist yet, except for a few little weaselly things like the Firefox browser. You know, it'll only take Microsoft another few days to patch Internet Explorer, and we'll have a perfectly good Internet Explorer again. We don't need Firefox.
Innovation is actually made up of two things. It is made up of the original idea, and it's made up of the delivery to the customer. If one has a wonderful idea, it makes a damn bit of difference whether it's a good idea or not if you don't deliver it to the customer. In 1992, Digital Equipment Corporation offered Microsoft a 64-bit version of NT. Microsoft decided that they were not going to incorporate that into the NT of that day because the bulk of their market was a 32-bit space, and consequently it would disrupt their 32-bit space in order to give people the innovation of having a 64-bit operating system to do their work on. Now they finally have decided that it's worthwhile, and in Longhorn, in another year or 2 years or 3 years or however long it takes for Longhorn to come out, we may actually have a 64-bit operating system. But we already do. It's called Linux. Because in 1995, I gave Linus Torvalds a 64-bit capable system, and he made Linux 64-bit compatible in 1995. And consequently, when Itanium came out with their Intel came out with a 64-bit chip, Itanium, Linux was the first operating system to be able to boot on that and run.
There's another point about 64-bit and Itanium and AMD and Intel. Not only did chips come up and run Linux, the chips were prototyped using Linux as the first operating system. So it's not a one-way street. The innovation in terms of hardware and software, idea and delivery works both ways.
I don't want to play devil's advocate like John is doing, but I do think it's important to give credit where credit is due. And proprietary software can be very good. It can be very reliable. It can be very innovative. It can provide solutions to customers. And so can open source. And I think one of the things where we do ourselves a disservice by minimizing the skills of the people on the other side of the world is by being facetious about them, being calling them troglodytes or other nasty names. It really isn't fair. You know, there have been mistakes in the open source community. For years, Mozilla was one of them. There have been mistakes in the proprietary world. And I think what we need to do is recognize that one of the things that the open source community is forcing is innovation on the part of the proprietary companies as well. And they are forcing innovation on us. So it's a kind of competition. I mean, I know what side I'm on. I'm not like John in favor of proprietary software. But I do think that we need to give credit where credit is due. One of the things that I've come to recognize is that there are some very smart and very nice people working at Microsoft. They don't all have horns, although I think maybe Steve Ballmer does. But, and many people at Microsoft will tell you privately they don't agree with him, and they wish that the company policy will change. Just as we heard today that there are people at Sun who think that maybe Sun's strategy was wrong and Sun's management has made wrong decisions. So I think one of the things that the open source has done is it has fostered innovation not only in our own community but throughout the software world.
There's a tendency towards bravado among open source zealots, developers, fans. There's a friend of mine who's a VP of engineering at an open source based software company who will get up at public venues like this and say that open source software will always meet and exceed the capabilities and quality of proprietary software. And it's a great thing to say. People get up and cheer. And when I've heard him say it in more private venues, I add two caveats. One is given enough time and money, and the other is given that proprietary software stands still in the meantime. It's not a race in the traditional sense. And in fact, the presentation we had from our friends here from, working in the state of Hawaii is a good proof that if we're really in a customer-driven ecosystem, what the customer wants, what solves their problems, provides a solution, is what it's about. Even at the OSDL, the center of gravity for the Linux ecosystem, we have some interesting debates. When we have our users advisory councils, our own staffers would get up, Wookie in particular, and say, Linux and its open source stack, that's what we're talking about today. And then every end user in the room would talk about the mix of applications they actually run in their real systems. And it was always a mix. And in fact, when we began our data center initiative, we realized it wasn't about the operating system, it was about workflows and loads and stacks, and that we were out to identify gaps. And if we spent all our time identifying gaps and not filling them with open source software, we would be doing a disservice. So the data center initiative now is perfectly happy to identify gaps and fill them with what works, not what we would like to work. So while there probably is a universe in which every piece of software in an environment is Microsoft, there may never be a universe in which every piece of software is entirely open source. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think open source as a notion is a continuum and is thereby philosophically very different from free software.
And to which I'd add that we've combined what Larry and Bill just said, that there's a lot of cross-pollination that does happen both ways. And when we do get caught up, as we often do, about, innovation, I mean, this is an agenda that has been tabled in front of us as open source people. I don't think this is a conversation that we went looking for and said, okay, let's compare our innovation against your innovation and let's see who's, reaches further. This was a purposeful conversation put on our table by competitors they see themselves competitors to open source and free software. So, I mean, I think it's always been a tradition, especially in the Unix world, to look at someone else and go, hey, what are you doing? That's pretty cool. Let me see if I can do it and do it a little bit better or do it a little bit differently. And as long as we don't lose that part of the conversation when we're talking about innovation, that, hey, do we also have the ability to identify the best parts of other people's ideas and identify the mistakes as well, and then jigsaw that together with our little bits and pieces of ideas. I mean, it's right back to standing on the shoulders of giants. Can
I just add one other point to what John had said earlier? I don't think that, I know that it is not fair to say that open source means the end of capitalism as we know it, or that it means that somehow or another the proprietary software industry is suddenly going to go broke. They do face new challenges, and they're going to have to deal with it. But there is still plenty of opportunity for companies like Microsoft to make money, and simply because there is open source software in the world isn't going to necessarily hurt them, except maybe a couple of decimal points in their earnings. I don't think that it's fair of them to blame us for some of the problems that they're having. But one of the things that I think John is a little bit right about, just a little, not too much, is that open source software has democratized software on a world basis. So one of the things that it almost certainly will do is, as a proportion of revenue, the amount of revenue received by American companies is likely to be less, and the opportunities for other countries in the world to profit from and benefit from open source and other kinds of software is going to be a great advantage. And so if we look at it from the position of a Microsoft shareholder, or perhaps taxpayers in the state of Washington, there may be a shortfall in revenue over time. But as far as the entire world, the entire basket of things is concerned, I think what we're seeing is the rest of the world is going to get better.
Whenever I've heard this particular comment come up, free and open source software cripples innovation, there's always the because that goes with it, and that because is because it reduces the amount of money that can be made from that innovation, and therefore people are not motivated to create that innovation and to release their ideas because there's no financial incentive behind it. Well, the problem with that is that it has been proven wrong throughout a lot of American history. You know, the universities that do research in operating system and in human interaction and things like that and publish their papers because that's what universities do. The funding that they get both from the government and from private industry to do research, all of that is innovation and innovative work. And a lot of that has been turned into products by various companies. It isn't necessarily that the innovation has to be made private, although that's what more and more it seems that a lot of universities are doing. They're saying, oh, we want to make money for the university over this, so the research that we're doing is going to be privatized, and we're going to sell it off to somebody, or we're going to create a hothouse to create products, or we're going to spin off a company to do this. And the problem, I don't have any problem with that really, if it's a private university that's being funded by private funds. But if it's a public university that's being public, that has public funds, and some company comes to them and says, we want to do this, I kind of look at this as the public having to pay for the research 3 times. Once when the university was supporting the professor who was doing the work, once when it is sold off to some company and they put some type of a patent on it or something like that, and the final time is when you pay for it with the product itself. I think that there should be some limitation on what can be done in public university with public funds and public research, and privatizing that research or making it available to everybody who's a taxpayer. And finally, one other comment: the stack that is used for TCP/IP inside of the Microsoft product actually came from BSD Unix. Right, inside the NT version. Right, but hey, they could have used that stack and brought it into NT, right?
Yeah, I remember we had to pay for it. One thing I want, before we demonize everybody, is Microsoft actually has 3 CPL products on SourceForge. So, as somebody mentioned, they're not totally blind to this. They know what's going on. Another interesting thing that's less known in the three SourceForge projects they have is that there is an open source project called Open.NET Compact Framework for their mobile devices, Windows C kinds of stuff. And they awarded the folks who maintained that site and created a project the Most Valuable Professional Award, of which there are 2,000 people or so, worldwide. So they're definitely not blind to it, and it's a great project. It was interesting it was notable that the Open.NET CF project changed to CPL from, I think, a license that we associate more with open source than CPL after that award was given. I never asked them if that was the cause of it. But nevertheless, it's still a recognized license by OSI, so I guess that's okay. The other thing is on the Apple side of the world. I've never quite figured out this whole Apple Darwin OS 10 thing, and I noticed Xcode uses GNU CC. It's free, so I guess that's okay. But there's a lot of mixtures, as some folks mentioned here, between the proprietary and open source code that's going on now. I think Apple's probably the most hybrid of them all when you look at Mac OS 10 and the tools around it. And proprietary software does have some innovative qualities I do like. For example, we were talking earlier about, I was using Impress for my presentation today, and I was using the beta version of OpenOffice 2.0 and just going nuts because there's some really weird bugs. But it's beta, so I said, okay, I'll live with that. But another thing is iLife 05 from Apple, which is very proprietary. Gee, I really want to play with that, even though it is proprietary. So there are some cool things out there in the proprietary world. Even though a lot of us spend a lot of our time with the open source stuff, I think some of us here do mix it up.
You mean Apple's system? Yeah. Well, first off, one point that people often get confused on is exciting and innovative. And one of the reasons why, and Apple does innovate a lot, no doubt about it. A lot of technology companies do. But sometimes we get caught up and we think that what's cool is innovative. And we think it's cool because it's marketed well and they've got nice graphics and they can put people who can really dance really well on TV with their products in their hands, or people that you grew up with and they're playing music to us and they're gods to us, now they're selling little black ones. And, cool often gets mistranslated to innovative. As an open source developer on the desktop, I always know what's cool because that's what appears in our wish lists. It appears on Microsoft's new OS or Apple's new OS, and within a week, there's great clamor for, we have to have this. If we don't have this innovative feature, we're going to fall behind and we're not going to be any good. And if, if you just ignore it for a couple of months, and it's, so I mean, we often mistake, cool for innovative.
Don't confuse following your competition as being as cool as your competition or being cool at all. In fact, if you want to be in the Linux desktop business, following Microsoft is essentially a way to run out of gas because they have enough resources in that area to stay ahead of you. They've got more market share. They've got more people working on it. They have a roadmap. There's more unity within their organization. And you're setting yourselves up for failure if all you do is follow your major competitor. And that's, again, it's not really innovation. Microsoft, like a lot of other people, is innovative in areas we forget about. We tend to focus on the innovation on the technology side. Open source breeds innovation in business and business models. The term business model wasn't really current until open source came around because it changed the central tenet of software sales from an arbitrage model, I've got it, you don't, let's negotiate, to one where you had multiple vendors, multiple models, multiple ways of solving the same challenges, both in terms of technology and software. The mention made of the open source CE.NET compatible project is an interesting case, and I would caution you from giving our friends in Redmond too many kudos for being such good guys about it. What Microsoft is doing, quite cleverly, with CE.net on the commercial side, let alone its open source work, is they are subsidizing the cost of deploying their software and their technology on high volume embedded devices by making up the money on the infrastructure side and charging more for their server software, and by locking people into what they believe longer term could be a proprietary standard, at which point they can come back and say, gotcha, it's royalty time. And in fact, the CE experience, the whole, since I spoke on CE this morning, I'll go back to the notion of consumer electronics. They went out of their way to buy market share. They didn't actually have to lose a lot of money doing it because they subsidized that business with the back-end software, and they undercut their competition from Symbian, from VxWorks, from embedded Linux, by making CE on these devices effectively free, and even by fostering open source equivalence. This is not about goodwill. In fact, none of what we're doing is really about goodwill. It's all about different ways of doing business at the end of the day and solving problems. But I think if you're going to award notions of goodwill, don't start doing it in Redmond. Think about what they're really up to. They're very clever, very smart business people.
Sure. One thing I wanted to mention, it's funny you should mention about the cost of CE, because one of the complaints from the hardware manufacturers to Microsoft about CE was that their licensing was just too darn expensive. I think they were charging $25 a unit at one point. So they were really more expensive than Symbian and some of those other solutions, Linux VR, those kind of guys. I think they did lower it recently to like $10 a unit or something, something more in line. 12, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a, you know, like any other proprietary operating system, you know, it's more complex than I guess we really want to get into. But it's still, I think, interesting that they would even acknowledge those folks, you know, regardless of whether it was goodwill or, you know, being nice or whatever. Yeah, they could have just ignored them.
We have a question from the floor or a point from the floor.
Yeah, okay. Have you ever used a tool that had the grips, the hand grips, in the wrong place? It becomes an extremely difficult to use tool. Well, exactly. Nothing makes it to market and survives in the market unless they are in the right place. The software industry is one of the few markets you can sell into with the hand grips in the wrong place, if you will. You're right. Apple makes things feel easier because they make it easy. They don't necessarily decrease the power. If you actually go into through the Apple operating system, look at all the things they provide, all the options they provide, how they provide them, it's not a stripped down operating system. It's an operating system with purposeful design, and that's very different. They do innovate. Think of Expose. Where did you see that before? On sitting in somewhere you can actually touch it on a computer, you know, in the mass market. That was pretty new. They come out with their duds. I mean, that little sidebar on the side of mail.app was a stupid idea, and they got rid of it. The dock is been ripped apart by several ex-usability people from Apple, or ex-Apple usability experts. Tog, for instance, has a huge rant on his site about it. They make their mistakes, no doubt about it, but they do innovate. The cool I'm talking about, though, is the fact that Apple came out with lickable buttons, and they do cool ads, and except for the switchers ads, which were just a little bit weird. But they know how to market cool to people, because their niche market is cool people, or people who like to think they're cool, right? Artists and stuff. So they market cool well. And what happens is that I gave a talk on usability in August at the Academy, the World Conference KDE, and I opened it up talking about this island in the Pacific. I'm trying to remember which one it was. Anyways, during World War II, they watched airplanes come in and land on their islands and neighboring islands, and they'd bring supplies with them. And they saw, they saw this happen all the time and thought, oh, this is great. Oh my goodness, there's like these new gods that come down and bring food. And all of a sudden, when the war was over, the planes stopped coming. So what this group of people did is they built a mock airplane landing site. They moved down the grass. They had a landing strip. They put a tower up, and they put a guy up there with something that looked like a radio. I kid you not. Yeah, and they thought that this would bring airplanes down, and with it, they would get supplies. In open source, and this is the whole copying thing, we look at the coolness that we see, and we practice landing strip usability and landing strip development. We look at what we believe or what we think or what we perceive is the cool part, the good part, the innovative part. And we run off as quickly as we can in the exact wrong direction and start making landing strips on our islands, and the planes don't come. And this is really why it's important for us to, I think those of us who are working on the desktop and those of us who are encouraging people who are working on the desktop could do well to look back at the people who brought the server side to where it is. Because those people, they sat back and they looked and they said, what is innovative and what worked and what can work, and hey, what cool things can we do that actually make sense? And they sat around and they did the really hard work. It wasn't a bunch of running around after the latest release of some company's software. Real innovation, and picking what the good ideas are, coming up with your own ideas, and that's the important thing. That on the desktop side of it, I think we're unfortunately still in our infancy with, and yeah, I mean, just read the conversations that happen on the Slashdots of the world on a regular basis to see how people chase after these pipe dreams of supposed innovation. Whereas I know of exactly one Compose-like application on Linux. I mean, we often ignore the real innovations.
With all due respect to my brethren here, in order to keep this going, I have to disagree violently with them. If we look at the innovation, and I thank Aaron for making his comments about innovation in the server, I believe we should give Microsoft credit where credit is due. Everyone today wants a directory, and the directory they want is Active Directory and not OpenLDAP, which takes 10 times longer and 3 PhDs to get installed. And we have not innovated in open source to make it easier to instigate that directory. On top of that, they've innovated and produced a marvelous communication tool called Microsoft Exchange. We have no answer to Exchange that is open source. We failed to innovate and deliver innovation even though we've had 5 years to do it. And if it comes to the desktop, for you poor folks out there, how many of you are dentists and doctors and carpenters, and you run your own business and you want to replace that evil commercial software with free open software? Where do you get that practice management software that's open source? Where can you get that accounting application that supports standard file formats? I mean, that's all available in Windows. You can't get that in open source. Is this not proof positive that the open source community, A, does not listen to your needs, and B, is simply not capable of innovating? They want to reproduce fangled desktop things that look cool and spend a lot of time and energy polishing the dipstick in the engine while the oil still is dirty and hasn't been changed. What was that?
Not doing your job good enough. Rolling around in pain right now with the idea that Microsoft innovated the directory. Where are the Novell people? Are they here? Are they still in they're probably still in the vendor area. That's too bad, because they'd be like, what do you mean Microsoft innovated the directory? We had our directory product out long before that. I mean, now we're back to talking about copying. And commercial software, it's not commercial software, it's proprietary software, because open source software can be commercial too. But nitpicking. Open source groupware, yes, we are late on it. For those of you who are looking for those solutions, take a look at some of the things that are out there right now. Open Exchange has gotten a lot better recently. Colab is a very interesting project, although if you have multiple domains to support, we're not there yet. Open groupware is toddling in the right direction. So I mean, we're getting there. I mean, these are things that we didn't get to yet. You know, I mean, we look at the server, we were miles ahead, and while they've been catching up on the server, we're catching up on the desktop. It's just where we decided to put our weight first.
While they were catching up with the server, let me see, it was 1989, and there was a research group of Digital Equipment Corporation in Bellevue, Washington, headed up by a gentleman by the name of Dave Cutler. Dave Cutler was one of the chief architects of RSX-11 and VMS from Digital Equipment Corporation, and he was chartered to come out with the next generation operating system for digital. To make a long story short, Dave Cutler was screwed by Ken Olsen and left the company in disgust, took a bunch of engineers with him, and went to Microsoft. And 6 months after he did that, Microsoft announced Windows NT, a wonderful new revolutionary server operating system, which, by the way, just was remarkably like the project that Dave Cutler was working on at Digital Equipment Corporation. So much so that it was rumored that there were like dollar signs in the interfaces, which were representative of the same interface design of VMS. So again, the innovation that was touted was not innovation as much as it was purchasing power. Well, you see, there was this consortium called the ACE Consortium, which was set up, and there were supposed to be 3 different architectures supported by Windows NT. One was Intel, the second was MIPS, and the third was Alpha. So it happens that MIPS and Alpha were 2 architectures that Digital had bought into. Notice they didn't support Motorola, they didn't support Texas Instruments, they didn't support, R6000, they didn't support a wide range of chips, they didn't support Spark. Just those 3. And they quickly dropped Motorola and just stuck with Intel and Alpha. And then eventually, of course, they dropped Alpha when they got the last of the dollar signs out of the interfaces. So, yes, it could be assumed that they were forced by Digital because of intellectual property transfer, let's say we call it, to supporting it.
Be careful what you wish for in terms of this kind of shiny, eye candy level innovation. There is a lot of shelfware that is easy to install and attractive to demo, and the really best shelfware recapitulates for managers what they think their teams do on a daily basis. But when you actually try to deploy it, you begin to run into some interesting problems. System administrators tell us all the time that the fact that it's not easy to script Windows environments makes it really, really difficult to customize anything for the simplest practical task. And since we were talking about directory servers, an area that Microsoft has been failing in abysmally is university-based directory servers, where you have huge numbers of users that change every 90 days because the students come and change their classes, change their names, graduate, and re-enroll. And in general, OpenLDAP does that without blinking. It may be harder to install at this moment in time and maybe not as easy to configure from the demoware standpoint, but you have universities all over the world benefiting from it and large corporate fleet environments benefiting from it, and they have almost to a company or organization tried and thrown Microsoft out because it just didn't scale. And that story can be repeated across several important technologies that Redmond is otherwise very proud of.
Well, maybe I made a mistake mentioning Active Directory. What about iPlanet? And what about Tivoli and CA? They have massive, tremendously powerful LDAP servers with all of the tools and utilities to displace Active Directory. Why aren't they making such great inroads, given that we have a deficiency with Open LDAP?
We're not talking about innovation now, and we're talking about exactly what John just mentioned a few minutes ago, and that's buying power, marketing power. Those things have, I mean, if we want to talk about innovation, we can talk about innovation. If we want to talk about the ability to move the market around, those two things are completely disconnected. Unfortunately, it'd be really nice if it was just a race of, who can innovate, the best, who can integrate the best, and that would be it. But it isn't. As far as Open LDAP goes, and it's funny, this conversation's come up a few times since I've been here. The problem that, as I see it, and I could be wrong, but the problem as I see it with Open LDAP is one that's very familiar to me from working on the desktop. And that is that Open LDAP to work properly requires integration with a huge number of applications. Open LDAP by itself is kind of like it's a little weenie database. It's a tree. To make it do cool stuff, you have to hook it into authentication of pretty much everything out there. Fortunately, a lot of stuff uses PAM these days, but a lot of it doesn't. And they have their own special needs, and you need, some things require certificates, cryptography certificates for things like VPN, so that needs a certain schema, and you need this schema here and that schema here. And what it means is that you're not just building one piece of software. You're building a piece of software, and then to do it right, you have to go and you have to coordinate a huge world of projects that traditionally haven't had a lot of interface. I think this is familiar to me because a desktop is not a project. A desktop is the amalgamation of hundreds of discrete projects, each of which you have to bring together and get everyone on the same page to cooperate and kind of figure out what we're doing, and we're slowly getting there. freedesktop.org is our means for doing that, among others. That is a place where innovation can also happen, and that's in organizational and development behavior. And that's one place that open source really has innovated. We have turned the world upside down when it comes to development methodologies. We're not the only group that's done this, not the only way of doing it, but that is one thing that open source has innovated. Look at the resources that have gone into building this software versus the results we've gotten out of it. I think that's pretty innovative. We do have places where we need to learn, such as how to coordinate hundreds of distinct individual projects so that they all go in a direction that's complementary. Note that's different than getting everybody to march in the same line. We need to go complementary directions. But that's another place that often gets overlooked, and that's in our how we actually do what we do and how we build software. And that's not even so innovative itself. It's just a rebirth of something that was commonplace, a few decades ago. It feels innovative now. I think it's a great idea. Are we going to start a project, or? I mean, that's what it is, right? We have a lot of people saying, well, where is it? We need involvement. And to be perfectly honest, we do have these things underway. I named 3 projects just a few minutes ago that do all these things. No, they don't. That's Open Exchange. There are others that don't. Take a look at Colab. As a great example. They actually defined an open standard for storage that follows other standards such as iCal, vCal, all those other things. And that they documented how they do their storage. So another project called Citadel has actually implemented the exact same back end. So you can take a Citadel server and replace it with a Colab server, or vice versa. And you can keep your clients in the front end, of which there are numerous as well. To say that it isn't happening isn't true. To say that we are late is true. To say that we're getting there is also true. So get involved, support these projects, take a look at them, support the developers. If you're a developer and you really have this itch, scratch it hard.
Yeah.
I think one of the key differences between proprietary and open source technology relates to the kind of problem you're throwing out. You got an itch, something happens. You got two alternatives. One is to go to Steve Ballmer and try to convince him to order his programmers to scratch that itch of yours. The second alternative is to go out to the rest of the world and find someone, or yourself, to scratch that itch. Which alternative is better? Which way is better? Sometimes Steve Ballmer has the same itch you do, and he will tell his programmers to fix it, and he's got multiple billions of dollars that he can pour into scratching that itch, and he will come up with it and innovate a solution that will be a good one, presumably, or at least adequate perhaps, or wait till someone decides the itch is worth scratching and do it themselves.
Well, see, I have a slight problem with that, because if you have the itch, and Steve Ballmer has the itch, and he pulls billions of dollars of Microsoft's money into scratching your itch and his itch, I think his stockholders should fire him, because you're the only two people that itch. And that's the problem with Microsoft. Only if they feel that there's a large enough market of people who are all itching and can be scratched in the general area. I'm not going to scratch any other place, because that's going to really get bad, but in the general area, will they solve that itch? And that's the right thing to do for his company, his stockholders, right? But he doesn't have unlimited resources, and he doesn't have that capability, because he still has to make a profit. And that's and in the open source space, if you've got 5 or 6 people who all itch the same way, that might be, and they're all programmers, that might be enough to get that project off the ground and get you some relief. Also, you can go down to the drugstore and get calamine lotion.
No. It's a point of sale system? Yeah. Yeah, and that happens everywhere. I just realized that I've said a few times that we were late with groupware and that we ignored it or whatever. And following up on John's comment, it might be interesting and elucidating to actually explain why we were late, because it helps understand how innovation does and does not happen in the open source world. How many programmers are here right now? Okay. How many of those programmers, keep your hands up, how many of those programmers use and like groupware software? Oh, look, all their hands went down. Now, who does, now ask lawyers. How many lawyers are in the room? How many love their groupware software? Exactly. Now, who does Microsoft sell to primarily? Business people or developers? Now, traditionally, who has been the people that open source has been fueled and funded and aimed at? Well, developers. So what has happened is that business people and lawyers, among other people, and I use the term people in connection with lawyers loosely. Yeah, I did, thanks. They are starting to become attracted to open source, and they're starting to come over onto our boat. And on our boat, we have these fleas, and they're called lack of groupware, and they're getting itches from them. So now this itch has suddenly arrived. It's not like we didn't innovate, we just never had the need to innovate. You don't innovate into a vacuum. You innovate towards a solution. Microsoft does this. What was their problem? Well, people need to coordinate. Who coordinates? Business people. It's the manager who says, oh, I'm going to get Fred and Ted and Joe and Sally, we're going to go have a meeting, let's coordinate with that and do it quickly so I can get my golfing in. That's not something developers do. We turn around and yell at each other, or we email or we IRC, because that's just way faster. And then we show up 15 minutes late. That's how we work. So what we're seeing here with groupware in particular, and LDAP is kind of similar, is as our community is expanding, what our requirements are changing. And so as our requirements are changing, Imagine that. Our innovation directions are changing. Why do we have group R servers instead of, the pyramid? Instead of, a few, 0, 3 or 4 years ago to, I can now count, I think, 5 or 6 on my hand. Right now, at the top of my head, of projects that are doing this, because now there's niche. It's being scratched. So when you come in as a business person and say, well, where's the groupware? You're the reason why it's being written. And if you can, support it.
This particular line of discussion highlights a semantic point that I always find bothersome. In open source, one of the worst truths about open source development is that, in general, the community, such as it is, does things not because they're needed, but because they're interesting. Well, isn't that what innovation is? Doing stuff because it's needed is boring most of the time. Until it's interesting to someone, it doesn't happen, and that's this incremental model we've talked about. As the need spreads, the requirement is perceived by the right folks, it becomes interesting. Interesting is fairly subjective here. But that's innovation. Doing it because someone else did it, or a few people think it's necessary, is not interesting at any moment in time. That's unfortunate, and that goes back to something I said before about how and when will open source get ahead of its proprietary equivalents. Well, only at the point that it is interesting technically, interesting financially, or both to the right subset of developers, maybe not the whole community. Some people are deeply offended by the statement that the open source community, whoever they are, only does things because they're interesting. But I think that's the most innovative feature of the whole community.
Most of us, in the time that we were learning programming and stuff like that, saw a picture in a book someplace called the software pyramid, okay? And across the bottom of the software pyramid, there was the operating system, which everybody needed, and then slightly up from that, there were the compilers and libraries and things like that. And then up at the top, there was the applications that only a certain number of people used, and somewhere in the middle, there was the middleware, and there was the office products and stuff. And that is pretty much true, that's what's that, because everybody more or less needs an operating system down at the very bottom, okay? Now, when you take a look at how the GNU project started, Richard Stallman didn't start with a kernel, right? That wasn't his first project. His first project was Emacs, right? A text editor, and an editor that could help programmers out, because he was a programmer, right? And that went, and then the GNU compiler suite, right? C, Fortran, libraries and stuff like that, the things that every programmer needed. I mean, those were the things that both interested programmers and were needed by them. And eventually he got enough stuff going so that this young kid at the University of Helsinki says, hey, almost everything's there except, the kernel. And that's interesting. And poof. If Richard Stallman had started with a kernel, he would have had to have redone the kernel project every 2 or 3 years because new technologies were coming out that would have made his kernel look uninteresting and unuseful. So the other interesting thing about this pyramid, of course, is that the bigger it gets with the number of people using the software across the bottom, then the wider it gets with the number of people using the software in the middle and towards the top. And there's more and more people who say, yes, I not only want to use that software, but I have the expertise to write the software, and I have the time to write the software, and I will write the software. But if you've only got Richard Stallman and Linus Torvalds writing free software, you're probably going to have a very small set down there at the bottom. Yes, sir.
I'm going to toss some fleas at you.
tax software is a completely different animal, and the reason for that is because it's a legal minefield. It's to get it right. I mean, oh boy, not only is it dreadfully boring stuff to do, but you also have to have a bunch of accountants and tax lawyers and whatnot helping you out. And if you get it wrong, bad things happen. And you have to get it right in every country, and that's a huge amount of effort. And it's the kind of thing. You mentioned that maybe there'll never be a day when everything is open source. There are going to be some pieces of software that are better developed or developed more naturally as proprietary software. Who knows if we'll ever see or we'll see in the near future tax software.
I'm sorry, but every year the Brazilian government ships every taxpayer they can find, which is kind of hard, a piece of software. It used to be on a self-booting DOS disk. Now it's a self-booting Linux disk, I have been told, that comes up and interviews the average taxpayer about their income, has information about what they've paid, or lets them put the right numbers in, and ship their return off to the Receita Federal and decide whether they should go to jail or not, or whether they have to bribe a fiscal. But it's Linux-based. In that environment, it made perfect sense to do. It's just in our socioeconomic condition, it does not. No category is sacred.
Well, the other question is, but I mean, they ship that application over, but is it open source? Can you go in and change that application to say, change the multiplier of taxes you're supposed to pay from a 2 to a 1, right? I had a friend of mine who wanted to get a contract from Hertz for his business for renting a car. And they shipped him the contract in an Excel spreadsheet, which was locked through encryption. Unfortunately for them, he was an expert in security, and he broke the encryption. He changed the contract and sent it back to them in the Excel spreadsheet, signed. And they said, okay, and they didn't check it. And he has a gold Hertz membership now for €1 a year. And he showed it to his lawyer and told him what he did, and his lawyer says, that's legal. He said, you sent it back, and they accepted it. And it's just like you crossed a little line out in the contract and sent it back. They should have checked it. Pardon me? Illegal but under the DMC, but they don't support that in Europe. Yet, okay. But going back to the concept of, is every program going to be open source, and looking at the software pyramid again, at the very top where there's maybe two companies and they're both fierce competitors, and they say, hey, one says, hey, I'm going to develop a program that I'm going to be used in my business, and I don't want to expose that code to my competitor, my direct competitor. I doubt very seriously that program would be open source. So, I agree that there's going to be some programs that are going to be closed source and proprietary. But that, there's also a huge amount of code that I think falls into the area of what I call coopetition, where doctors compete with each other, but they also want to cooperate with each other. Lawyers compete with each other, but they have a certain amount of software that they want to cooperate with. The software that is not at their core competency. The software that everybody uses and adds relatively little to their ability to compete, or be better at whatever they're doing than their competitor. And I saw a talk today about Open Vista, which is software that was developed for the Veterans Administration hospitals, open source, and it allows hospitals to do a better job of administering their hospitals. And that is going to hopefully increase service,
line. Not because we don't think they're valuable, but because the industry expects them to behave a certain way, and it is more valuable to the ecosystem that the technology be shared in common than it be differentiated. And in fact, there's a nasty word for innovating below the value line. It's called forking. And great examples of forked up software are, well, even within the wonderful world of Linux, you'll find distribution suppliers who shall go unnamed, who supply very cutting-edge versions of libraries or somehow differentiated, rebranded, renamed versions of packages that require a different installation paradigm, and that attempt through technology or innovation, very much like our proprietary friends, to lock customers in through no value added, but only by innovating in a place that's only good for them. And I certainly would say the value line moves around, and one man's commodity might be another's innovation on a given day of the week. But when you look at larger communities of software suppliers, developers, consumers, you pretty quickly discover where the value line is. A community that we're looking at right now is that of the shrink-wrap ISV, the independent software vendor. We acknowledge that there's a lot of off-the-shelf software out there. It's not going away. There's no reason to even talk about it going away. And it should run on Linux. Linux should be just another host at the end of the day. It's part of the movement forward. And when I talk to these software vendors, they have Linux on their roadmap. They look at it like another host, but instead of treating it as one version of Solaris or another version of Windows NT on their roadmap, they'll support 3, 4, 5 distributions in 3 different versions. They have a hard time justifying their return on investment. It slows things down, innovating below the value line. And we did a survey. The average ISV supports 1.2 versions of proprietary operating systems and 3.3 versions of Linux. There's something wrong here. So when you talk about innovation, don't do it in a vacuum. Talk about it in terms of an agreed upon value line, and understand that there is such a thing as adding negative value.
Here, here. We actually talked about that at yesterday's panel as well. There's a bit of a go back and forth. I was actually going to switch the topic back to the idea of is there anything to innovate, but I think John has something to add to that in particular. Yes, why don't we do that first?
The same thing brings about another complaint in the open source industry and stuff, that standards hamper innovation and hamper, creativity. And I just want to point out that actually standards allow for a great deal of goodness and value to be added. Ken Olson one time said that he didn't like standards because they were as uninteresting as a Russian truck. And unfortunately, once again, he was quoted for that. But what he meant was he hated to be on standards committees because they nitpicked over everything down to the last dime, and he didn't like that type of work. But as an engineer, once the standard was created, it was his job to make it faster, better, more robust, more scalable, all the things that still allowed the thing to happen. And so even if you have a standard, fixing a bug so the thing now works properly, that's good. Making it work faster by maybe using a different algorithm, but you give exactly the same results, that's good. Making the code fit up into the cache better so it works faster, that's good. These are all things that, although they're not truly innovations per se, it's what makes a great software product.
Yeah. No, but I think you're the majority. Yeah. think that 99% of innovative software has been evolutionary. It's just a matter of when we recognize it as innovative. I mean, everything is cobbled together. There's very few, out of a vacuum, amazingly huge ideas that occur. Talking about standards, I mean, one of the things that standards do is they allow collaboration. They grow a community because you, by definition, have a greater number of people working in a similar environment. And it's been proven time and again that human beings innovate radically when we throw a whole bunch of creative people into the same, you know, whether it's a Parisian coffee shop on the street corner, or if it's you know, art bungalows in Manhattan. Innovation happens in groups, and that's an important thing with standards. It creates groups. If you do feel that, you know, I'm reaching, what am I going to do? What itches do I have left to scratch? Get into a group of like-minded, you know, get into a group of your peers. Discuss things, and you'll quickly discover there's a whole world of relevant, like not just, you know, pie-in-the-sky research that needs to be done. There's a lot of that too, but there's a lot of really relevant questions that are unanswered, unimplemented today that impact the server, the desktop, the embedded space. I mean, I could, yeah, and what I often do, go, you know, to the pub for drinks with friends, and we sit there and we talk about nothing else all night than what are the things that are open questions and what are the possible answers. If I had 10 lifetimes, I don't think I could answer them all myself. Unfortunately, there's thousands of other people to do that. But there's always questions, and the key is collaboration.
Well, I'd like to pull a little experiment here. Is there anybody in the audience here who does not use Linux on their primary desktop system? Would you stand up, please? So I presume that everyone who is seated is using Linux. Okay, remain standing, please. Remain standing, all of you who do not use Linux as your primary desktop system. I'm going to ask you each in turn, what will it take to get you to switch? Like to exclude money. Let's start on the right there. What one thing do you absolutely have to have before you would be induced to switch?
The first computer I had was a Macintosh, because I came into using computers, like, I went to do, oh gosh, I'm trying to go through this. I went to do a nursing course. They told me I couldn't take a nursing course because I was a dinosaur, and I didn't use computers since I had graduated in 1978. So I started doing all these, going back to school. I got an Apple computer so that I could communicate with my siblings who started on Apples, and that I could function within the university system who were predominantly Microsoft. But then gradually the socialization system became that I had to learn how to use Linux, and then I had an experience with using Sun products, and I think it's the socialization system. It's where you are at the time, and that there has to be some flexibility. That people can learn new things, and that and Linux is getting easier to use. It's easier. I mean, at first it used to be very more difficult to install. In the last few years, it's become much easier. It's like it's ease of use. It's, you know, adoption, ease of use or usability. It's an easier system to use now.
Thank you. What one change is necessary to induce you to switch to Linux today?
It's not a matter of something inducing us. We have a proper plan. The technical implementation plan is there. And when we do going into open source, we have our objectives as well. And being in the government, our primary objective is to be able to serve the citizens well. Our guiding principle says that it has to be least disruptive to our daily operations. So we cannot just switch like that. We have to follow that systematic stages that we have in our technical implementation plan, and that includes like training, getting people to be ready, and things like that. And also, if it is not time to change it, we don't change. We do that. One of the basic principles is fit for purpose. When it is time to do so, we do it. Like when we have already paid licensing fees for a lot of that. Why do we need to change? We have paid for that. We have to be practical, so we still use it. Then we wait for a time where it is practical to change, then we change. So that's why we have that our technical implementation plan drawn up. So that guides us in our implementation. Thank you.
Yes, because we're all I need at this point in time, because I don't work in a development environment. I work in strictly like a work type of a situation. So that's all the demands I have right now. So I just need simple applications to sort of, get on the internet, email. I don't collaborate with a lot of other people to do projects or something like that. I don't need a lot of... No. I've used Star Office and I learned to use it in 3 months. I probably could use it as well as I used any of the Microsoft products. And it was I could switch. It's not, it's a little bit cumbersome because you get used to using one or the other, but when you're in a situation where this is what you're going to use now, or not that it's sort of such demand upon you, but it's just that that's what tools are available to you. Then you learn to use. If you live in Hawaii, you learn to eat state lunches. If you live in California, you go to Italian restaurants. I don't know.
Thank you. Gentlemen, we've given the ladies a good deal of time to answer.
It's important because when people say, I need an application, but they call it by a specific brand name, then in their minds they lock themselves into that brand from that work. If instead they do the analysis and say, I need a relational database, I need a mailing system, I need a browser, then it opens up their minds to looking at other things other than a specific brand. That's all. And that. And that's fine. That's fine. Just
gentlemen, very short answers this time. What one thing would induce you to shift or to change your desktop system today?
the users I support, I mean, the platform I support is on Windows. We have a lot of vertical apps that run off of it. Actually, I use both desktops, but because of the vertical apps in Windows we have to support, that is one of the requirements.
I think the issue is that there's never one thing about why you use a platform, and why is a Mac user and not a Linux user and not a, well, I guess you could call them kind of a Linux user, Unix user. But there's always a constellation of reasons that you use any particular thing, including the brand of hammer you might prefer over another. You might have a small hand, you need a smaller grip hammer or something like that. I know for me, I think like some of the other folks there, I use both desktops. I have two notebooks, one each, using that too. And the problem is that there's just a constellation of reasons. For example, Open Office. I was just struggling with Impress trying to do my thing here and couldn't do page numbers. Beta version, so okay, I accepted that. But then I ported it to PowerPoint, thinking, well, I'll fix in PowerPoint and bring it back to Impress. Well, gee, something happened to the file because I couldn't, put it in. Little things like that.
From my own experience, migrating from one computer system or another, or for example, converting from one word processor to another over the course of my career in both computing and law, there's an inertia. I don't know that there's a specific reason, but I remember in the legal profession, lawyers were using WordPerfect. And you would say, why in the world aren't you converting to Word? It's a better word processor than WordPerfect. You don't have to remember codes and other kinds of things. And the lawyers would say, well, I don't have compatibility. I've got to be able to do this, that, or the other thing. But as you watch that conversion scenario over a period of a couple of years, it suddenly happened. There was the slope changed for some reason or another, and almost instantaneously, it was remarkable to watch. Lawyers who said that they would only work with WordPerfect because they didn't want to learn anything new, and they had a word processor that worked perfectly adequate for them, and they had briefs and other kinds of things, suddenly they changed. And I will too.
One of the reasons why they changed was that the legal profession in general had developed a huge number of macros for WordPerfect that, were allowed them to do these briefs very fast with just a number of finger clicks and stuff like that. And what happened was that Microsoft went in and did an amazing amount of work to replicate those macros for Microsoft Word, which allowed the lawyers to change. And plus they started receiving lots of information and briefs and stuff from people who were using Microsoft as their customers. And so that also forced them in. I'm on the other side of the coin. I haven't used Microsoft products for over 2 years. My notebook doesn't dual boot. I don't have Microsoft at home. I don't have any Microsoft licenses. For that matter, I don't have any proprietary software licenses except for my Palm Pilot, which I love dearly. So I'm guilty. I use proprietary software in my Palm.
We'll take 3 answers very quickly.
You want the really super short answer? Super short. My PowerBook has to break again, because if I'd answered this yesterday, it would have been Linux. Have I answered it a week ago, it would have been Mac again. So, it doesn't matter to me. Emacs runs both places.
I think computers are just a tool. Regardless what operating system that you're running, as long as it does the job, you're comfortable with it, and it would work. I mean, basically, you could run anything. If you're Chinese, you'll be running in a Chinese version of Linux or Windows, whatnot. What you're comfortable with.
I have a really short answer. Tablet PC.
Hi, my bosses keep giving me Windows machines.
What was that?
My bosses keep giving me Windows machines.
Folks, in 1999 I started to eat my own dog food. In April 1999 I switched from using Microsoft Windows to using nothing but Linux. Because I'm one of the people involved in the Samba project and I have to keep myself up to date on Windows, I do dual boot between the two. What I have noticed as Linux has matured is it's become easier to use. I've also become more familiar with how to use that environment, and I have to be honest with you, I find it incredibly frustrating to use the Windows environment today. There are a lot of things that I can do much better and much easier in Linux than I can in Windows, and yet there are a few things that are missing. I'd love to see an accounting application that's available that will meet my needs for Linux. We'll eventually get those, but only when the companies that produce those proprietary software applications begin to recognize that there is a market opportunity that they are not tapping into. I've approached accounting software companies to that effect. I like Mind Your Own Business, which, as it happens, was written for the Macintosh and not for the Windows environment. It was only belatedly ported to Windows. So I've said to them, you've already gone through the porting process, why don't you support it on Linux? And the answer is, no one has asked us for it. We're not going to do it until people ask us for it. Additionally, I have polled over a dozen Best Buy stores and CompUSA stores, and I've spoken with the store managers and said, why don't you sell notebooks and desktops that are preloaded with Linux? And the answer was, nobody ever asks us for it. I said, well, that's rather interesting because I know many people who have bought PCs and notebooks from your store and have just blown away the Windows system and put Linux on it, and the reason they haven't asked you for it is because you don't have it available, so they've learned how to install it themselves. Well, he said, if only half a dozen people asked us in any 1 year for Linux on a PC, we would carry it. Now, how many of you have asked your local store to carry Linux on a PC or on a notebook?
But let Walmart sell 5 more computers with Linux on it, and they'll put it on. When their competition starts making the sales that they don't, then they'll do it.
There's, I think, another reason why I personally have been really reluctant to make the switch for my desktop. I've watched a lot of programmers boot up their Linux systems, and out comes this screen full of gibberish, and then comes a prompt, and they're sitting there typing characters that, I don't speak foreign languages, but I don't even recognize it. And the fact is, I'm a computer professional, quite frankly. I spent a lot more years of my life doing computer programming than I have as a lawyer, and I don't want to go back to that world. I don't want to sit there and look at characters on a screen. I want to have a system, and I believe it's coming. I believe it's actually here. In fact, I got a copy of the disk that I'm hoping to go home and load. As soon as I can get out of this room, I'm going to race off and start to do it. And I know that that's available, but it hasn't been until recently. Yes.
This is one of those comments that everybody in the room probably already knows, but I just want to make sure I say it, is Linux does not equal open source. I mean, Linux is an open source, product that we all know and love, but it's not all of open source. And there's no reason why you can't run open source on your Mac OS 10 box or your Windows 2000 box, your Windows XP box. And in fact, that's one of the foot in the doors that we've been using to get people aware of open source. And I'm not asking you to change to Linux today. What I am asking you is look at this concept of open source, look at what it's produced, like OpenOffice, like GIMP, like, you know, a whole bunch of stuff that you can run on your Windows box without having to change the way you log in and everything. And maybe later on, you'll find Linux interesting, and you already know the applications that run on it, so you don't have to learn new applications now. You already know how to do OpenOffice or GIMP or whatever, and now you just tried up the platform for it. I'm sorry? I'll tell you something funny. I did a chapter for digital camera hacks for O'Reilly earlier this year. And in one of the chapters, I said, I can't just do all Windows stuff in this. I got to throw in some open source. I mean, it's O'Reilly, right? So I forced myself to learn GIMP. So I used GIMP and Photoshop and PaintShop Pro. And I said, with 2.0, it's actually not bad. I mean, 1X, I was like, what is this interface, right? But with 2.0, it's like, I get it. This works for me. It's really improved. If you haven't tried 2.2, which is out now, try. I think 2.2.1 just came out like a couple weeks ago. It's really changed, and I think you'll like it. Yeah, I was not a fan of it either.
Just one thing I would add as a proviso too. Well, we can use open source and free software on proprietary platforms. Keep in mind when you do these things, where support for free software and open source comes from. And by support, I mean the development of. And the shock and horror of it is, it isn't on proprietary platforms, with very few exceptions. Sun, Solaris being one of them, the other Unixes being them, but it's kind of not a coincidence that they're all being subsumed into the open source and free software world. That's just the proviso I put there. Don't think that it's very, very true. Right. Okay, let me platform was a bad word. Platform was a bad word. Let me say operating system, okay? When we put it on, there are environments that are friendly to free software and environments where it's a sterile environment, where we send our free software out to sail upon the grand ocean, and people use it and love it, and it does not get fed back. Doesn't get a sustainable amount of support back from it. And all right. Let me say that clearly again. Which is fine. It's not a question of which operating system can you pick. Should it be 100% free software, 100% proprietary, or whatever? It's about picking environments where there is feedback into the cycle. And if the Java platform is one of those, it's one of those. If it isn't, it isn't. But that's just the one proviso when I hear people talking about keeping people on certain platforms with free software.
Well, I understand your point, and I can respect it, but I just think that if you take that attitude, which is perfectly fine, that the end result is you're going to not have a market share. And if you want to promote your product, not for money, but just because it's a good thing, because you think it's a good thing, else you wouldn't work on it. If it wasn't a good thing, you wouldn't work on it. Or if it's not a good thing and you're working on it, it's probably a bad idea because you're working on it for the wrong reason, right? I don't know. I mean, you generally work on a product for a couple of reasons. Either it's something an issue needs to be scratched, and even if you're the only customer, you're your own customer, that's fine. I mean, I've had a lot of projects like that where I just needed something I needed. Or you want to share it because you think it's a good thing everybody else should use too. And I think there's lots of projects like that where you look at it and go, well, that's kind of weird looking, but maybe I'll try it. And go, hey, this is actually pretty good. And then there are projects where you just want to make a lot of money. So there are different reasons, right?
It's interesting that the crabs are leading this. The bucket. I got one more thing.
There was a gentleman here, and unfortunately he has left, and that's too bad, where he said that he felt that an operating system was an operating system and so forth and so on. It really didn't make any difference because it was just a tool to him. And I've been using the same program for the last 25 years to make my resume. It's called TROF. Well, it was called TROF. That's when it came out from AT&T and used a Mercantile typesetter and stuff like that to do it. And then during that time, I created a set of macros that allowed me to format my resume perfectly every time. And after a while, TROF went away because AT&T stopped supporting it and so forth. And then, lo and behold, an open source project called GROF came about. And GROF did exactly the same thing as TROF, so my macros still worked, and everything was fine. And then about a year ago, I went to update my resume, and I tried to execute my macros with GROF, and it broke. I says, oh, no, I need this stupid resume, and now I'm going to have to stick it in some type of word processor, get all for it. Wait a minute. I'm going to find out why GROF broke. And I pulled down the source code, pulled it up, found out that sometime in the past they stuck in some type of new startup file, and I didn't have it in my environment. So I went in, put the startup file in place, told it I had A8 paper or whatever, letter-sized paper, and everything was fine. If that had been a closed-source proprietary product that didn't mention that I needed that file, I would have been stuck. But with open source, I was able to fix it and continue on with my work. And that's one of the reasons why I like it.
But you're an engineer. You're a programmer. You're not.
That's true.
Not a business person or a nurse.
That's true. That's true. But and I won't answer that. That's true. I'm an engineer. But the thing is, if I didn't have that capability, if I wasn't a software professional who could read C and understand it, I could find somebody who was. No, but the thing is, the problem could have been the platform. The point here is that the value that I perceived out of that system was the fact it was developed and distributed as an open source project, okay? And I could get the source code to fix my problem. And if I had to go back to Microsoft and get that fixed, you know, I would be at the mercy of Microsoft because they're the only ones that have that source code.
If you had written your original resume in WordStar and then over time converted to Multimate and then converted to DisplayWrite and then converted to Word, not only would you have a much better word processor than the one that you originally wrote your resume in, but not only that, it would still be working because every vendor has made it possible for old files to be imported into the new program. Not every, but most, as the professional word processors got developed. And they had file conversion programs, and if you had been using proprietary word processing programs through that entire period, your resume would still be available.
You're missing the point. My resume still is available, and I haven't had to do a damn thing except put that one little file into place.
Except that you're not going to use your crappy little word processor to write legal briefs. Or, you know, the technology has improved since whenever you first started having a resume.
My word processor I use for my resume is Vim, because the macros do everything for me.
I'm playing you with this.
Yeah, you can take over the role there, Larry. You want. Yeah.